Okay, just to remind you, yesterday we went into depth on Kant, Descartes, Heidegger. It's going to give you a background for what we're about to read now. So let's go and get into the review from not the last time, but the time before that, and then we'll continue on from where we left off. So time before last, we basically went over Heidegger's background a little bit. We talked about the fact that he was a little bit controversial because of his political leanings, but how his contribution to the field of philosophy is nevertheless highly important, especially for the West, because he directly confronted the Cartesian tradition, which had become a barrier to the West actually being able to implement Marxism in the way that the East was able to do successfully, right? And the reason that was necessary is because Hegel and Marx require you to take being for granted in a way that the East does, and the West does not. And the West does not take it for granted because of the Cartesian philosophy, which holds that there are two different kinds of things. Res cogitans, which is the thinking thing, which is Descartes' take on the subject, and res extensa, which is the extended thing, which is his take on the object. And so basically what Descartes is doing is he's boiling down the subject to just thinking, and he's boiling down the object to just what can be measured, right? And the idea about this is to get clear and distinct facts, clear and distinct ideas, rather, which are facts, based on what can be verified in reality, right? But that doesn't mean you understand that doesn't mean you understand anything on a fundamental level, right? Because the individual is far more complex than merely his thinking faculty. And the object is far more complex than just those things that you can have a clear and distinct idea about, right? And that's kind of where Kant gets into it as well, because Kant talks about everything that has to happen before you actually have an idea about it. And so what Kant uncovered actually is the preconscious. And that then led to Freud. And in my view, it also led to phenomenology ultimately. But if you stop at Kant, right, then you only really see like this mechanistic sort of version of sense perception becoming concepts, which isn't that much of a departure from Descartes. So you have to take Kant's insights and go farther. That's what Freud did. That's what Lacan did. And whether he was aware of it or not, that's also what Heidegger did. So in my view, you can't really have, or I'll put it to you like this. Maybe you would have Heidegger, but you wouldn't be able to understand Heidegger without Kant first, right? And you certainly wouldn't have depth psychology. You wouldn't have Freud and Lacan without Immanuel Kant. In fact, if you really look into Freud's history, he was obsessed with Kant. He read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason multiple times. And if you really understand what Kant is saying there, you see where Freud got his idea of the preconscious basically directly from Critique of Pure Reason. That's where it comes from, even though Freud's not explicit about it, right? So, moving on. Starting with paragraph 83. The problem with the subject-object distinction is that it can only regard beings as objects for a given subject. And this is Heidegger's objection as well, right? This makes for a notion of objectivity that is a priori idealist. The notion of subject also implies a specific view of objects as mere utilities for its realization. So in the question concerning technology, Heidegger talks about what Haas is talking about here, which is breaking down objects in reality as being mere utilities. And he talks about this as basically breaking things down into a standing reserve. And what he means by that is basically taking Cartesianism to an extreme, such that instead of having a relationship with the object, you just distill it down to its useful components, right? So you no longer see the river. Like one of the examples he uses is a river dam, right? So you no longer see a river. You no longer see this culture that grew up around the river and has a relationship to the river. Now you only see the number of, joules, energy units that this dam that you're building across the river can generate, right? And so it narrows your understanding of reality to such an extent that you ultimately lose your humanity that way. That was kind of his critique of it, right? And when you look at yourself as only a thinking thing, then you no longer question, where do your ideas come from? What kind of relationship do you have to other people, right? What is it about yourself that you're not even aware of? Because you only think of yourself in terms of your conscious aspect and not your unconscious aspect, right? Moving on. Subject, moreover, defined as res cogita, the thinking thing, is thought itself taken as its own real object. So I kind of alluded to that just now, right? So in other words, what it's saying is you're taking your faculty of thinking and you're taking that as the fundamental object, because that was what Descartes did. So Descartes was a subjectivist in the sense that the only thing he knew for sure was that he existed as a subject, because otherwise there would be no one to think about the question itself, right? So the subject was fundamental, and he defined the subject as res cogita, which again boils it down to just a thinking thing, right? And then that becomes the most real object that can be said to exist, right? This implies an alienation of thought from reality, foreclosing its scandalous incipience in being. Okay, now that sounds like a really complicated sentence, and it is. That's a very complicated sentence, but this is what he means. And actually, he's actually speaking a little bit from Lacan here as well, by the way. So if you remember from last time, we talked about Lacan's mirror stage, right? And how once a child began to develop language and an ego, there was an alienation from the unified self that had the interior syntax based on sense perception, and started to think in terms of the mother tongue, started to think in terms of language, in terms of conscious thought exclusively, right? And so then you had to bridge this process via the pre-conscious to try to excavate the unconscious, right? But there wasn't this thoroughgoing connection, right, between the unconscious and the conscious mind. So that's what Lacan called the alienated subject, right? So that's what he's talking about here. This implies an alienation of thought from reality, right? Because our direct confrontation reality actually happens on an unconscious level. And that's actually what Kant was getting at. That was Kant's insight. So we confront reality on an unconscious level, and then we process it, and it arises to the consciousness, right? And so when you boil down the subject to just a thinking thing, you are taking the Lacanian alienation to its extreme, right? You're chiseling that into stone. You're foreclosing its scandalous incipience in being. Incipience means emergence, more or less, or imminent emergence. So something that's about to come into being, right? That's what incipience means. And so what Haas is saying here is that where thought actually comes from is the unconscious and the individual's relationship with being. It doesn't come out of nowhere, right? And when you boil down the subject to res cogitans, you're completely discounting that. You're completely ignoring that, right? That's what he's saying. This notion is the final conclusion of idealism. For Heidegger, metaphysics is such, right? Moving on. Marx already accomplished the rejection of the culmination of idealist philosophy, especially in his early writings. But the incipient materialist language he made use of, such as man, class, mode of production, etc., later fell victim to inevitably metaphysical conceptualizations. So Marx was a Hegelian, and Hegel was not a Cartesian. And so Marx didn't have the Cartesian baggage. But his readers in the West did have Cartesian baggage, right? And so when they read Marx from a Cartesian point of view. That's why his concepts that he uses, man, class, mode of production, fall victim to metaphysical conceptualizations, right? That's why you have these sort of static, inflexible, and ultimately contradictory ideas of what Marxism is. It's because you have these people who are hyper individualists trying to force themselves into a collectivist idea, right? And really, when they do that, they're just trying to impose their individualism, right, on everyone else, which is really a form of Heideggerian projection, right? Some of these concepts were involved in the first breakdown of European Marxism itself. The changing nature of capitalist production and role of the proletariat ceased to neatly conform to their concept, and this was used by social democracy to justify its revisionism. So because the West read Marx through Cartesian eyes, right, and because Marxism is dialectical, of course, if you have a static understanding of what Marx is talking about, you're going to be way off. Because what Marx is talking about is a dialectical, which means changing over time and having historical properties thing, right? And so, of course, real life is not going to neatly, as he puts it, neatly conform to your concept, because it changes. It's not going to stay static. And so what he's saying is the social democrats looked at this and used that to justify their revision of Marx. So instead of being humble, right, and understanding, hey, things change over time, reality is historical, instead they said, oh, well, Marx was wrong, so here's our revision of it. That's what he's saying. Western Marxism, with its conceptualist orthodoxy, became infiltrated by metaphysics, so it's natural that only a Western thinker entirely outside Marxism, and even entirely opposed to it politically, could initiate the emancipation of Western thought from metaphysics. And he's alluding to the fact that Heidegger was a Nazi. And so we here in the West have to use Heidegger's insights to fully understand what Marx was talking about. And yet Heidegger himself was very much opposed to communism and therefore Marx. Heidegger may have been beset by various idealistic and politically objectionable peculiarities, but these do not define his primary historical significance. His primary significance lies in setting all thought on a basis which asserts its posteriority in the face of being. What he means by posteriority in the face of being is just that the subject doesn't boil down to res cogitans. That thought actually comes from not just the thinking thing, right? But the thinking thing and his relationship to being, right? So it doesn't boil down to this sort of subjectivism. You have to have this relationship with the object as well, right? To then have a dynamic internal world, right? That's what he means. By posteriority, he means a posteriori. So he means he's using Kantian terminology here to describe what he's talking about. And if you're confused about what that means, yeah, just check out the episode 10.5 where we allude to that when we talk about Kant. Moving on. The concept of Dasein helps resolve the fundamental problem of Marxist theory, the subject-object paradox, and its methodological individualism. For the first time, society, classes, and civilizations can be acknowledged as real in a manner consistent with the materialist view. Right? I think that speaks for itself. If you guys are confused about that, just leave a comment and I'll try to explain it to you. But basically, everything we just talked about, this concept of Dasein or being, that bridges the subject-object paradox. Right? Dasein does not necessarily afford contemplation exclusive significance. Okay, it does not necessarily afford contemplation exclusive significance in its overall issue of being. So it's not just another concept of the subject, not simply cognition, but practically being in the world, facing the constitutive disjuncture with being in its very being, right? It's a very complex statement, but here's what he means by that. He's just saying, whereas Descartes considered thought to be kind of a thing in and of itself that was independent of anything else and was actually even the fundamental thing, what Heidegger is saying is that it's not that at all. That you can't really even talk about being, right, in a meaningful way without both the subject and the object. And at the same time, if you just have the subject, then really you don't even have that, right? Because without being, talking about a subject without being is nonsensical, right? And so that's the insight that he's talking about. This overall phenomenological orientation permits thought to acknowledge reality without preemptively attempting to assume the consequences or implications it has for the thinking being. Right? So there's this sort of, again, this kind of Taoist sort of idea here, where you have to be in this receptive mode to objective reality and society, right, and being in general, to understand it. You can't have these preconceived notions about it. You just have to be receptive to it. Whatever consequences or implications there may be, they begin with being, not thought. And again, being subsumes thought in some kind of way, right? Because being is the subject plus the object, right? And it's the fundamental thing. So the subject, neither the subject nor the object are fundamental. They both depend on being itself to even exist in the first place. So being is actually the fundamental thing. I'm running out of time. Let's see if I can finish this. All right, I'm going to read these last 4 paragraphs and try to sum them up at the end. It is undoubtedly possible that Dasein can be conceived exclusively as an individual, but unlike the concept of the subject, it is not necessarily so, right? Because it can be social as well. Being as such is a common wellspring that cuts across individuated subjects and is the staging ground of any shared reality. So what he's saying is it's not a collective, it cuts across individuals, right? So many subjects participate in this reality, right? The reality is not the person or the group of people. It's something that cuts across those people because they all participate in it, right? It's a participatory thing. It's a dynamic thing, and it's a historical thing. Moreover, without acknowledging the incipience of thought from more fundamental being, Marxist materialism becomes an absurdity. Materiality becomes identical to thought of materiality, like substance, and thus an idea. And this way, materialism easily becomes idealism, right? And that's him talking about the Kantian Marxists, right? Because again, like if you don't acknowledge that thought comes out of being, right? Then you're making thinking the actual fundamental thing, just like Descartes did. And so then materialism becomes idealism. That's what he's saying. Dasein is constitutively a being already thrown in a world not only not of its own choosing, but whose givenness in the form of beings cannot be preemptively defined by thoughts, ideas, or concepts. And this is because of, if you remember, like what we talked about with Lacan, a child is thrown into the world before it even has any ideas or concepts. So it's already participating in being before it has any concepts, right? So being is prior to concepts. Being is more fundamental than ideas, thoughts, or concepts. It rather rests upon a relation to being as such, which can only be uncovered, right? Again, I go back to that mirror stage where the child doesn't even know that he exists as a distinct entity until it's uncovered to him by his mother holding him up to a mirror. And by then he already has some idea of who his mother is. And he didn't have an idea of who his mother is until he already had a relationship to her, right? Again, being is prior. Thinking is downstream from being. The real individual is thus set against a background within which their very individuated identity is subordinated to a more fundamental horizon of being. Dasein, in its incipience, knows no distinction between individuals or itself and others. It is not even a collective. Right? And that's what I was talking about before, where I was describing what he meant by it cuts across individuals. It's not the individuals themselves. It's the participation of those individuals with an objective reality. It's that entire thing is the thing that's fundamental. Not the individuals, not the objective reality, not any particular individual. It's what cuts across the individual and objective reality. That's being. And we're going to leave that there for today. And hopefully tomorrow we will pick it up from there.